Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin. I remind you to please turn off your cell phones to avoid any interruptions in the program. And if you don't want your photo taken, please let the Surrey Board of Trade staff know. We do use photos for both internal and external publications. Everyone, I'm Anita Huberman. I'm President and CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade. And thank you so much for being here today. Today is about celebrating the Trans Mountain Pipeline and Canadian energy. Are you excited? And everyone, this is the first of a series throughout the nation where we are going to energize our nation. We're going to ensure that everyone is focused on Canadian energy from a national perspective, but also tying it to international needs. We are charting Canada's energy future, and of course, the Trans Mountain Pipeline runs through Surrey, and we're very excited to celebrate that as well. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of our Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Tawasin, Kaikut, Coquitlam, our Inuit, and our Métis peoples. They have a profound connection to the land and water that surrounds our great city of Surrey. We have the largest urban Indigenous population within British Columbia right here in Surrey, and they are our economic partners in action, especially around Canadian energy. Events at the Surrey Board of Trade simply would not take place without sponsorship support. Thank you so much, and a great enthusiastic round of applause to our presenting sponsor, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Our community sponsors, Fortis BC, and the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. Our ongoing progress partners of the Surrey Board of Trade are the Chambers of Commerce Group Insurance Plan, represented by SNF Benefits, the law firm of Fasken, Focus College, Lighthouse Labs, and of course, Western Community College. A round of applause, please. I'd like to welcome from the Consulate of India, based in Vancouver, Consul Amitabh Ranjan is with us today. Everyone, the Surrey Board of Trade, our whole mandate is to support business, bring business into the city. We do that through a very diversified service portfolio. And we're really focused on ensuring we're enhancing the livability of our city. We're one of the top 5 largest Chambers of Commerce Boards of Trades in Canada. There are 430 of us. And this Thursday, at our annual general meeting, we will be celebrating our 60th anniversary of the Surrey Board of Trade. Yes, you can have a round of applause. And next Tuesday, we are going to be opening our second location, and it is going to be called the Surrey Technology and Skills Center, and it is going to be absolutely amazing. So we're so pleased to be able to do that on our 60th, right here in Surrey, British Columbia. And I wanted to also say that from a government advocacy perspective, when the Trans Mountain Pipeline was first announced to even be built, the Surrey Board of Trade was the only business organization in British Columbia that was the first to say, this is good for business. This is good for our economy. The pipeline runs through Surrey, and we really, ladies and gentlemen, need to focus on celebrating the amazing work and leadership of Ian Anderson, formerly with Trans Mountain. He's going to be speaking very shortly, but we are here to ensure that you are going to be leaving here today with a call to action. And every single province is going to receive a very similar call to action in the months to come this year. I want all of you to commit to being a Canadian energy ambassador. And that means you are supporting Canadian energy, not only from a national perspective, but to your international contacts. We need to move this economy in Canada, and we will do that through Canadian energy. So in the weeks to come, you're going to be receiving different messages that you can social media out from the Surrey Board of Trade and through our partner Resource Works. And we are going to ensure that Canadian energy is top of mind. So ladies and gentlemen, are you excited about Canadian energy? Yes. And to talk a little bit more about how amazing Canadian energy is, please give a great round of applause. He is the manager of BC Operations at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Please help me welcome to the stage Jeff Morrison.
Well, there's nothing else to say. I do want to take the prerogative of the sponsor, though, to say a few words. I thank you, Anita, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. I see lots of familiar faces here today. Some of them I've known for a very, very long time, and some of them are new. If you don't know, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers represents the upstream oil and gas industry in Canada and in BC. And CAP is happy, proud, and grateful to be a sponsor of today's event. Celebrating the completion of the Trans Mountain expansion is important. It is an essential part of Canada's energy future, and it will be making a lasting economic impact across Canada. I also want to thank, just as Anita said, Surrey Board of Trade for being the first out of the blocks to support this nation-building project. And in a moment's time, we will be hearing from Ian Anderson, who has so much of the credit belongs to him for his work for this project, and his work in fostering reconciliation too, I might add. Throughout his time on the project and along the entire project line, he put reconciliation into action. Oil and gas infrastructure and production activities take place on the lands and near the homes of First Nations, and that proximity fosters understanding and a relationship that benefits both of us. And I'll take just a second to talk about the oil and gas industry in BC, in addition to the importance of Trans Mountain. In BC, the natural gas industry has an economic impact throughout the province, and of particular significance, this is of particular significance when you talk about economic reconciliation. In January last year, and if people on their way out, this will be one of your speaking notes you can tweet about later, you can grab these on the way out. This is the upstream oil and gas industry in BC, which is an important part of the economy here. It's actually the largest resource revenue source for the government in BC. But what I will add here quickly is that the iTotem study, from 2018 to 2021 found that about $765 million was spent in BC's upstream natural gas supply chain with 135 Indigenous affiliated firms throughout Canada. $540 million of that was spent within BC with approximately 100 BC-based Indigenous affiliated businesses. The benefits of those are separate and in addition to those that are related to the Trans Mountain expansion, which also resulted in 69 mutual benefits agreements. And also, let's not forget Cedar LNG, which will be the largest First Nations majority-owned project in the country, and represented 20 community project benefits agreements along the Coastal GasLink project. Few sectors in Canada represent the similar opportunities and rate of involvement of Indigenous people, and we're very proud of that in BC and Canada and CAP. These are a few examples of the economic reconciliation and action that CAP represents and our companies represent. And with that message, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be here, and for CAP. We are a proud sponsor. And also, one last thing I'll say is every one of you have one of these, how Canada and BC can help meet the world's energy supply. And it's important for you and your friends to talk to your neighbors. You had that call to action. Sorry, I'm just ad-libbing here because I like it. We do not talk about this enough with our neighbors, and we have such an important part to play in the economy of Canada and even BC, and people don't recognize how big a part it is of our economy. And I'll add one more ad-lib. Our largest trading partner for BC is the United States. 20% of the value of everything we trade is natural gas. It's our single largest export to the United States. That doesn't include oil, that's just natural gas. BC is natural gas rich, Alberta has lots of oil, Trans Mountain's important for both of those things. I don't want to downgrade that. But soon we will be exporting oil and natural gas to the world, and we are on the precipice of an important time in our economic well-being. So congratulations to the Surrey Board of Trade. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you to ResourceWorks. Thank you to Ian Anderson. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And as I mentioned before, we have someone in the House who's played a pivotal role in bringing the Trans Mountain Pipeline to fruition, the expansion of it. And his commitment to Indigenous reconciliation was at the forefront during this expansion stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome, I'm honored to welcome to the stage, Ian Anderson.
So now I'm reminded why I would frequently leave Burnaby and come to Surrey to get that kind of welcome. Thanks so much, Anita. And Surrey Board of Trade was there with us at the beginning. They were excellent partners, and they were a voice that was not always heard, but it was always required. And thanks so much to Anita and the Board of Trade for the support over many years. So I've only got 5 minutes, and as I like to joke, I can't tell you how to get to my house in 5 minutes, let alone give you a bit of the history of Trans Mountain. But I'll give you a few tidbits, because Bikram's going to follow me, and he's got more of the story of Trans Mountain today, what it looks like, what it's doing. It's an honor to be here, and thanks, Stuart, to ResourceWorks for helping us put together as well. Up until May 1st of this year, when Trans Mountain went into commercial service, I and many others were still asked, will it be finished? Can it be completed? Can we get this done? As early as, just 2 or 3 months ago, can we get this done? And I have to say that it was no small effort, obviously, but the team that worked on Trans Mountain for 14 years stood behind the passion, the resilience, the adaptability, the courage to see it through. It's too long. I'll come back to that. 14 years. The original Trans Mountain was built in 9 months in 1953 after an act of Parliament for $93 million. It was a celebration of the day. It was built to provide energy security for growing Western Canadian sedimentary basin productions to the west coast of North America post-war. It was a landmark pipeline in our country's history, and I hope Trans Mountain continues that legacy and is a landmark in and of itself. Let me share a little bit of the journey, and Jeff touched on it, Anita touched on it. We realized very early on in 2010, 2011 that we knew how to engineer things, we knew how to legally contract things, we knew how to account for the dollars, but we hadn't, and we had to learn how to do business in communities. And I don't just mean Indigenous communities. I mean places like Surrey, places like Abbotsford, places like Merritt, where we hadn't been visible for 50 years. We were a pipeline on the ground that was safely delivering the commodity through British Columbia and down into Washington State. But we were going to be present again. So we had to reintroduce ourselves to community, and some of the great Trans Mountain team that did that is here with me today. We had to introduce ourselves to Indigenous communities that had no idea the pipeline was even there, let alone It was crossing their reserves. It was going through their traditional lands. It was crossing through sacred and heritage sites. So we learned. We listened and we learned. I was virtually in every Indigenous community between Edmonton and the west coast of Vancouver Island. We reached out to the west coast of Vancouver Island because the shipping traffic was going to go through, obviously, the strait, and it was an important aspect to the supply chain that Trans Mountain was serving. In fact, the original National Energy Board scope for the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, get this, did not include a review of the marine conditions and marine traffic. We went to them and said, no, you have to include this. We need to broaden the scope of the review because it matters to the people of British Columbia. So we broadened the scope voluntarily, and I'll come back to that concept in a little bit. Thousands and thousands of points of engagement within communities, tens of thousands of meetings, every Rotary, every Chamber of Commerce, every chief and council, every councillor's chambers, every longhouse, every place you can imagine, we went. And we went for one single purpose, and that was to listen and learn and understand how our work was going to intersect with their lives. We learned a lot along that journey. We changed a lot. I'll conclude with a few lessons learned, if you like, that won't be part of a book because I've decided I'm not going to write a book. I'd rather just give you chapters along the way for the next decade. But the pipeline that was finished earlier this year, while I haven't done deep research into it, I have to believe, and I would say, is the best dam pipeline in the world. Why do I say that? Well, it was built with state-of-the-art technology. Most of our pipeline infrastructure in North America was built back in the 50s and 60s. So state-of-the-art steel, state-of-the-art pipes, state-of-the-art construction techniques. We rerouted multiple times as a result of local input and local conversation and local concerns. We built a leak detection system along the pipeline that is state-of-the-art, best in the world, first time in a long linear pipeline application. We changed rules in the marine corridor of how shipping traffic will work and what kind of truck escorts and what kind of response capabilities are necessary. We salvaged tens of thousands of amphibians along the right-of-way, some of them more than once. Because as you know, we had many delays, so we have to go back and move the snails again. Through traditional lands, through historic and culturally sensitive areas, we uncovered hundreds of thousands of Indigenous artifacts that, unlike Justin Trudeau having to go to the Pope to ask for those Indigenous artifacts to be provided back to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, we're providing those back to those communities to do with them as they need to do. Whether that's replacement, whether it's salvaging them, whether it's showcasing them, whether it's putting them to rest. Hundreds of thousands of artifacts. Largest archaeological and biodiversity project in this nation's history was Trans Mountain. We built a tunnel through Burnaby Mountain, not because we were designed to build that or that was the scope, because that's what the community wanted. I did that for Derek Corrigan. But we did things like that at the end of the day, we can stand proud that we built this best pipeline anywhere on this planet. And it will be a legacy to the Canadian economy. It will be a legacy to the social programs of our country for decades to come. It will provide economic value. So along that journey, what did I learn? I learned to spend more time in Surrey, less time in Burnaby. Listening. Listen is the number one thing I have to tell you I learned from this project. Listen to the hearts and minds of the people that you're affecting. Could be a trade union, could be a community, could be an Indigenous council that maybe has 78 residents within their reserve lands, but whose lands we're going directly through. It could be politicians of every level, it could be mayors, councillors. We listened. We didn't go in with an agenda. We went with a white sheet of paper and we listened to the concerns. We listened to understand how those concerns could be met better. And in many cases, we changed things we were about to do. We didn't pretend that we had all the answers. We changed our mind countless times. whether that was a route, a construction technique, or even a contracting decision. I also learned, and most of you will know this, investor confidence cannot be assumed. We have to think about that as Canadians. This was built under the ownership of the federal government. It would not have been built otherwise. It's a sad state of affairs, but it wouldn't have been. Ownership of Trans Mountain by the federal government at the time was the best of a bunch of bad outcomes, but it was the only outcome that was going to get it built. So when we lost our permit on the same day that the ownership of the pipeline changed from Kinder Morgan to the federal government, we had some profound soul searching to do to how do we get this project back on track, and we did, and we got it finished. But investor confidence should be the thing we think about. When we think about the learnings from Trans Mountain, it's about how do we build investor confidence so that private capital can build infrastructure in this country, because right now we're on the precipice of not being able to do that, and we have to change that reality. The third thing I learned is the interesting space and intersection of municipal, provincial, federal, and Indigenous politics. They all intersect. They all have their own touch points, their own values, their own points of recognition and understanding, and we were caught in that web of who has jurisdiction, who has decision-making authority, how does that get executed, and how do I continue a pipeline project trying to navigate through that. So that's another learning we have to take forward, is ensure that jurisdictions have a clear line of sight to their responsibility, their accountability, and their decision-making authority. And I would add an important piece to that, increasingly considering Indigenous input into decision-making, not just on impacts, but on decisions. How do decisions of work going on in their territories get made, and what role do they have with them? It drives the regulators and the lawyers crazy even thinking about how we would do that, because we've got mountains of legislation and acts that dictate how decisions get made. Those need to be turned on their ear, and they need to be looked at to consider how do we create an environment where Indigenous input and traditional knowledge and understanding is not just a passive consideration of a proponent, but a part of the decision-making. We made it part of the decision-making. We went to every single Indigenous community and got their support and made many changes to the project on account of that support. Community relations, local relations matter. We spent a tremendous amount of time building relationships, because you never know when you need it. You never know when you got to make a call and say, I got a tough spot here, I need your help. That could be a mayor, it could be a councillor, it could be, you know, a business owner, it could be a head of a trade union, it could be Anita at the Surrey Board of Trade. Build relationships. You can't go wrong by having too many relationships. The last thing I would say I learned, and 14 years, by and large the same team for 14 years, wouldn't have happened with tremendous amount of dedication, resilience, adaptability, and commitment to a cause, the creation of a vision. Trans Mountain was a vision, you know, before we talked about what the expansion even was. It was a vision of need for our nation that we were prepared to commit to execute against, and we did, but it took a tremendous amount of resilience. I mean, Kinder Morgan in the spring of 2017, we were $1.1 billion in, and they were done. They couldn't see a way to finishing this project. We had John Horgan opposing it, we had Derek Corrigan, we had cases between the Supreme Court. They couldn't see a way to finish this. So they're prepared to write off their $1.1 billion, Ian, go back and run Trans Mountain, and we'll be happy. I said, we can't do that. Can't do it. Too important. Too important for the nation, too important for the people, too important for the future of Canada. So we went knocking on doors. We spent 6 months knocking on doors. Private equity, other strategics, upstream producers, Alberta, British Columbia. We ended up in Ottawa. And I thank to this day Bill Morneau, who saw the vision. Bill saw the vision of what Trans Mountain needed to be, and he was prepared to make the investment that they made in it. If it wasn't for Bill, it wouldn't have happened, and he was a very good man. So thank you, Anita. Thanks to Trans Mountain team. It was a journey. It was an amazing story. There are many, many stories to be told, and hopefully you'll hear more and more of them over the years. Thanks for you that have been involved in Trans Mountain over the years, and many of you have, and there's lots of familiar faces. And first and foremost, thanks for your support. It is an important project. It's critical to our nation. Hopefully we painted a bit of a Harvard Business Review for future projects that they can learn from, so we can do it in less than 14 years. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, in the early days, we were full of people that were, there was great adversity. But if you believe in a project, if you believe in the economic impact, you have to really meet that adversity and somehow persevere. And that's what we did together. And thank you for spending so much time in Surrey, because he knows that Surrey is an opportunity city. Thank you so much, Ian. It's now my pleasure to introduce the director of the Burnaby Westridge Terminals at Trans Mountain. Please help me welcome to the stage Bikram Kanjalal.
Well, Ian's always a hard act to follow, so. So anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Surrey Board of Trade, Resource Works, CAP, and everybody else here who's taken time off on a Monday to listen to me speak. So one thing Ian didn't have, he didn't have any pictures. I have some. But, you know, I think people are already familiar with Trans Mountain. Trans Mountain is this pipeline system connecting Alberta to the coast now. It's been in existence for the past 70 years. I know it's, as Ian often mentions, it was sort of underground and out of mind till it resurfaced about 12 or 14 years ago, as we started discussing about the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. So presently, with the Trans Mountain Expansion Project done, the system can deliver about 890,000 barrels per day. 630 could be directed to the coast. So there's a whole bunch of statistics that we can talk of. But really, I'd draw your attention to this picture here. Again, I have pictures. So this picture here is from the 11th of April, 7:30 in the morning, as this bunch of good people completed the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. This is mechanical completion. You know, as many people have often mentioned, and Ian mentioned as well, you know, Trans Mountain has been a story of resilience, courage, and perseverance. Right from the time it was built, the original one was built in the 1950s, to today, it has always been so. So although we, in this last 14, 12 years or whatever, we might have displayed you know, courage and resilience and all that kind of stuff, but there were people well before us who were doing all of that in order to connect Alberta to BC and BC to the coast. At this point, our mission is really to transport Western Canada's oil safely, competitively, and reliably, opening up international markets and unlocking Canadian resources. These are comparisons of how things were then and how things were in April when they completed the Golden Well. Back in 1953, yeah, maybe slightly different there. It was, anyway, the pictures in black and white. So we started up the system on the 1st of May of this year. And commercial commencement date is the 1st of May. And line fill, we completed line fill on it. It's about 4.5 million barrels of oil went in just to fill the pipeline, just to get the pipeline full between where it starts to where it ends. This is about 4.5 million barrels of oil. And following that, of course, once the pipe is filled, it's only then that we can actually start receiving the rest of the export oils into our tanks in Burnaby. So on May the 9th, we completed line fill. On May the 20th, we received our first tanker. And this picture here is of the first tanker coming in to our terminal, running under the Second Narrows Bridge, the rail bridge. The Dubai Angel has been talked about. And, you know, it was an angel. So, and today, we are receiving our 20th tanker at Westridge. So between that time and today, we've got about 19 under our belt. So what does the expansion project do, and where do we come from? 1,150 kilometers between Edmonton and the coast. We had a bit of extra pipe already in the ground in certain areas, Jasper National Park and things like that. That was done way back in 2008. And the restoration of that, actually, the Anchor Loop project, that earned a UNESCO award for the restoration of that location as the pipeline went through it. So we had to build about 980 kilometers of new pipe. 12 new pump stations, 19 new tanks. Most of them were built here in Burnaby. And the 3 new berths at Westridge. So the 3 new berths replacing our old 1 berth. When I first came on 12 years ago, I went out on the berth with my boss, and he said, "This is the Honda Civic of oil terminals, and we are going to build the Lexus." And that's what we've done. So just by the numbers here, and I'll have to sort of look at the slide as I speak through it. You know, there have been, whenever you're building a linear pipeline through a long distance, there are always challenges, right? The terrain, the things that you have to go through, the communities that you have to travel through, and the everyday hazards that you have to try and manage. And that's what Trans Mountain has been doing all this while. For the last, since we started actually putting our pipe in the ground way back in 2017, 2018, till the pipe got activated just last month, that's what's been happening. If you just look at the numbers here, over mountains, down dales, and across rivers, and under streams, and over roads, and under bridges, and whichever way you call it, it's arrived here on the coast. So railroad crossings, road crossings, water crossings, trenchless crossings, meaning you had to sort of dig a hole through underground and run it through. We built that tunnel up in a 2.6 kilometer tunnel through Burnaby Mountain. There is the last bit which was holding us up, and you saw the picture in the front was the pipe running through Mountain 3, coming through the Coquihalla. So all those were real challenges along the way. And besides that, there were other challenges, forest fires and floods and you know, other things that we had to deal with, which are all, you know, it's been in the news and people may be familiar with that. But it has been a journey, and we are sort of here in, I wouldn't say that the book is closed or the chapter's been written, because what we are here for is really a portion of the journey, because as we run through the rest of the journey, it is all going to be around operations. So what has been the benefits so far? For the indigenous and pipeline communities, $657 million in mutual benefit agreements, 69 mutual benefit agreements representing 81 indigenous communities all along the pipeline corridor. And Ian touched upon some of that. It was all around relationships, building the relationship and getting things done. A A lot of money spent on indigenous training programs. The most, the biggest thing I think coming out of this was really around the focus on reconciliation and involvement of those indigenous communities in the building of the pipeline. So as you can see, over 6,000 contracts worth almost $5 billion were awarded to indigenous-owned companies. And when we talk about stories, we talk about, I'm only speaking over here as a spokesperson, for all the 35,000 people who built that pipeline. So there are 35,000 other stories being told across dinner tables and barbecues or wherever else. And, they give me an opportunity to speak to you about their stories. So on the marine side of things, and you probably know that we had to run through it twice. So I don't know why Ian had to go and say, yes, we needed to do it, but okay. So we did it twice. So the first time we ran through it and we got our CPCN. And then, of course, in 2018, it all got knocked back. And we had to do it once again. And the focus on marine has been very important and quite timely as well, because what it has done is sort of an upliftment of the entire marine ecosystem and the management system of marine shipping for the South Coast as an entirety. So Trans Mountain, with its shippers, committed over $150 million into oil spill response. So that oil spill response capacity is now there and is being held together. And it's going to be a spend of about $50 million every year to keep that oil spill response in place. So that's the operating budget for that, and it's going on for the next so many years. Trans Mountain was also very instrumental in working with the Port of Vancouver on the orca whales. So noise reduction in the marine traffic areas, Trans Mountain was there right in the forefront. We were actually there to start the whole thing going to the ECHO program. So as it is from the oil spill response side of things, it's a doubling of the capacity, the significant decrease in the number of hours required to address an oil spill anywhere between the Port of Vancouver way out to the west coast of Vancouver Island and beyond into the Pacific Ocean. What you see here, the bottom picture, is a picture of the largest oil spill response vessel in Canada. So and that has been brought in and is now housed at Beecher Bay, where the operators of this vessel are in a partnership with the local indigenous community and built a base out in Beecher Bay just for oil spill response. The upper pictures, one on the top, a little bit on the right-hand side, is a view from a helicopter, because that's also what has been introduced now, helicopter operations out at Race Rocks to put the pilots off the vessels as they go through. So a whole bunch of things have taken place, and really what we are leaving or what we are expecting after this is to dedicate ourselves towards ensuring reliable operations, right? Reliable operations. Now that we have built it, it's much like Vegas, built it and they'll come. But it's not just building it, we have to operate it for them to come. So, and that's what we are involved with. And what does this sort of, in the longer term, what does this sort of provide Canada with? It provides that increased market access, which was the vision right in the very beginning when people started talking about the expansion project. It ensures that Canada gets full value for its oil. And it's sort of, and I'm sure others would sort of speak to it, the rightful impact that it's making. We know for a fact that the difference between the differentials have already squeezed quite a bit, maybe $4 or $5 or so for all the barrels of oil that we produce. And if you just imagine the barrels of oil that we produce multiplied by the change in the differential, that's what's coming back to Canada and staying in Canada rather than being given away into other hands. Efficient transportation. So the pipeline is obviously a very efficient means to transport oil out, But as well, if when you connect it up with marine shipping and you get the right ships into place and you have them getting access to global markets, that's what gets Canada's oil out to the Pacific Rim oceans, Pacific Rim countries. So it is only a very short distance from Vancouver to Asia, to California, other places. Things that would have otherwise taken days and years to get built, we took years to build, but we can get them out in days. So if you think about Canadian oil trying to find global access by sending it across the continent down to the Gulf of Mexico and then shipping out to different parts of the world, well, here it is in Canada on the West Coast and shipped out to whichever other country wishes to get into it. And I saw that there were quotations there on that handout from Jeff, which talked about different countries seeking access to Canada's energy resources. So there was a comment in Parliament recently about how the very fact that the pipeline was built has added about 0.25% of GDP. Well, that's probably more than what we have spent so far, but that works out. In addition, of course, there is this other economic benefit which comes through on the direct benefits of about $14 billion through royalties, income taxes, and corporate profits that are all coming into Canada. So that's really what we are looking at, this longer-term economic benefits. But in order for that to continue, what we have to do in Trans Mountain is really to dedicate ourselves towards ensuring reliable service, and that's what we are striving to do every day. So when someone says, are you celebrating? Well, it's only a sort of flip switch between getting it constructed and getting it to operations, and then continuing on with operations. So we haven't had a lot of time to celebrate, so again, my thanks to the group here for inviting us to celebrate with them, and that's where we are. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your good work. Thank you so much, Bikram. And now it's my pleasure to welcome a Global Fellow of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., a Special Advisor to the Business Council of Canada, and a Research Advisor for the Indigenous Resource Network. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Heather Exner-Pirot.
Thanks so much for the warm welcome. Anita, when you said that we are all excited about Canadian energy, you have great energy too. Too bad we can't bottle it up. I'm delighted to be here. I actually got to be on the same flight as Ian this morning and got to hear some of his battle tales in the last 3 hours, which has been delightful for me. And happy to be here to celebrate Trans Mountain, because a lot of the stories we've heard in the last few months and the last few years have been about the cost, being wildly over budget, exposing the flaws of our regulatory system, the challenges with our federal politics and the ways it can be dysfunctional, and literally face some biblical conditions of plagues, floods, wildfires, environmental NGOs. Last one's a joke. But there's so many things that had to face, but now we're in celebration mode. Now we can look back, some of this is a memory now, and we can take stock and celebrate what has been achieved for our country by the people of Trans Mountain and everyone that was involved. So what does it mean? I'm going to let you know what, from my perspective, what it means for Canada economically, geopolitically, and then finally address the environmental side. So we just mentioned it was worth 0.5% of GDP, according to the Bank of Canada. Just think of that, a G7 nation adding that project. Imagine if we had 2 or 3 of those, we'd be looking pretty good. Increasing our exports by 14%, increasing the revenues to Canada, if you consider 500,000 barrels at $80, that's $40 million a day, almost $15 billion a year that you get with our trade balance. It is an expensive pipeline, but it will pay itself back. According to Trevor Tomb, it has revenues of about $3 billion, will have, with expenses of just $500 million. And I want to address the differential. These are incredible. You know, we throw out these big numbers. $14 billion, 0.2.5% of GDP is an incredible number. But for what it means, in particular, I'm an Albertan, and for Albertans, is we should be looking at what size of statue of Ian Anderson we want to put in downtown Calgary. Because that differential, for every dollar we narrow between WTI and WCS, and as we've said, it's already been narrowed by a few dollars, that differential once in 2018 was $55. That means the Canadian barrel is worth 55 American dollars less than a Texas barrel. And in the last year or two, we had narrowed it by about $20, and now people forecast that we might get down to $14, $12, $10. Each dollar that we narrow the differential is worth $600 million to the Alberta budget. And so when you add up the royalties from the extra 500,000 or 600,000 barrels, the extra $600 million for every dollar of differential, this pipeline is probably providing to every single Albertan man, woman, and child about $1,000 a year. So thank you, Ian. This is definitely worth it. It's obviously benefiting the rest of Canada too, but just a tremendous gift to people in our province. So an incredible, you know, even though you could have saved some money maybe and maybe had a private investment, in retrospect still a slam dunk, just economically a slam dunk to have this. But even more so, and from my perspective, is geopolitically, how important this pipeline is to Canada, and I'm going to say it, to the Western liberal world order. It sounds so haughty when you say it that way, but I think it's true. Canada to date, and we have some of the statistics from Jeff, which is great. You know, we're the 4th largest oil exporter, 5th largest natural gas exporter. We are significant. But we've allowed ourselves really to be a regionally significant player instead of a globally significant player. And that's because we send the vast majority, about 99% of our natural gas, 96% of our oil until this year, to the United States, and really have allowed ourselves to be an oil colony, an energy colony of the United States. And they were a great customer until the shale revolution, and then it wasn't so great to be relying on a single customer, and now we've expanded that option. I want to put it in perspective. Maybe you've heard Canada has the 3rd largest reserves in the world. The top 8 countries with oil reserves, the other 7 are OPEC countries. They are authoritarian OPEC and Russia. Canada is the only OECD nation in that top 8. The United States is number 9, and it's going through its reserves very quickly. Norway is not in the top 10. And so when you look at what oil supply and demand will be in 20 or 30 years, Canada is going to be the one holding that option from a democratic, liberal state for our allies, and that will be very important. We look at, you know, I always lament that Canada has not used its incredible energy resources strategically. Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, Iran use their oil power in a strategic way almost every week, and we have not even tried to use it strategically. But as we look at the future, trying to displace Russian oil, trying to preserve that OECD market share, Canada will become increasingly important. Not only oil, but I wanted to acknowledge LNG when we're looking at this from a geopolitical situation, because BC is becoming now, we finally got the oil flowing, but we'll get it flowing on LNG too. So we all see that Coastal GasLink is completed. LNG Canada Phase 1 will start to liquefying and exporting next year. Wood Fibre, just down the road to Calgary, and it's just down the road, maybe for you it's a bit further, has started construction. Cedar LNG, if you didn't see, the Haisla Nation had a referendum on Cedar LNG, voted 93% in favor of moving forward. You don't see those numbers very often, 93% of a community supporting something. This is a community that is very knowledgeable, very informed, and providing consent on that project. Should get a final investment decision in the next few months. And then Casilla Sims is also going forward. We saw the NISGA say that they're planning to start construction on Prince Rupert gas transmission line, I think to make sure they maintain their approvals, but that's obviously a project that is going through the paces and has some demand. And where is all this demand going to come from? And you mentioned the absolute strategic competitive advantage BC has is being a straight shot across the North Pacific to Asia. Asia already has 5 billion people, but maybe you didn't know that this year, in 2024, over 50% of the global middle class will be Asian. They will hit that threshold of representing 50% of the global middle class. And actually between 2020 and 2030, there'll be an additional 1.5 billion middle class people in Asia. And those people, when you become middle class, you become a consumer, a much bigger consumer of energy. The EIA, the American Energy Administration, already says they expect oil demand in the Asia Pacific to grow from 36 million barrels a day in 2022 to 52 million in 2050. And we see the same kinds of numbers with LNG also. So getting that, not having to go through the Red Sea or the Panama Canal or the Straits of Malacca through the South China Sea, having that straight, clear, cold shot through the North Pacific is going to be so helpful and give our allies so many more advantages than they have with their options today. Finally, I want to just address the environmental side, because this has been, I guess, the Achilles heel and still concerns of why are we expanding fossil fuels in 2024? And for me, myself, philosophically, and I think there's many Canadians who probably feel the same, certainly in Calgary there are, I think we are better off, we are a leader in this world when we are better, not when we are smaller. I think the easy thing to do is to have degrowth and to have less and to offshore our high-emitting industries. The hard thing to do is to become incrementally a lower intense, more ethical producer. And that is what the oil sands are trying to do with Pathways Alliance. That is what we're going to see come through TMX, hopefully the first net zero heavy oil, which is a very challenging, difficult, expensive thing to do. But the federal government is trying to support, the Alberta government is trying to support, and the oil sands CEOs themselves are willing to put up billions of their own dollars to make sure that we can be proud of the oil that flows through this pipeline. LNG, BC LNG, is already the best in the world, already the lowest emissions. And we've seen also, Ian mentioned it a little bit, but the Indigenous impacts, maybe we'll get into in the conversation. All of the LNG projects I'm at have been path-breaking on Indigenous relations in their own way. But I don't know if there's another project, speaking of the best pipelines in the world, another project of any kind in the world that has had more Indigenous consultation, that has done the outreach, 117 Indigenous organizations and communities. I don't know that there's anything in New Zealand or Australia or the United States, certainly not Canada, that comes anywhere close to that scale of the consultation that was done. And so for many reasons, we should be proud of this project. But I kind of want to finish here, is to say, I think the environmental reasons, I think we are doing better and we will do good. And environmentally, there's a case, certainly a case for BC LNG, and I think a case growing for our heavy oil. Not only can we heavy oil, if we stop burning heavy oil in 50 years, we can still turn that into materials, into asphalt, into carbon fiber, into carbon, many markets going forward. But the important thing for me is the role we are playing in really a high quality, ethical energy security for our allies, and not least in Asia, where billions of those people do want to move from being amongst the least developed into the middle class. And so we are providing that service. It's something I'm proud of, something Albertans will benefit from, Canadians will benefit from, and truly a great occasion to celebrate. So congratulations to all involved. I'm proud as a Canadian of this project.
Thank you so much, Heather. Next, I welcome Rory Johnston. He's the founder of Commodity Context and a lecturer at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Previously, he led commodity economics research at Scotiabank, where he set energy and metals price forecasts and advised the bank's executives and clients. Quite an impressive background. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Rory Johnston.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the Surrey Board of Trade and to ResourceWorks and to CAP for the sponsorship. So thank you all for having me here. My name is Rory Johnston. I'm the founder of Commodity Context, and I am here primarily to add, much like Vikram did, to add more photos to this kind of discussion and to add some kind of charts and some other kind of graphics to kind of allow us to better understand some of the things that we've discussed today, things like the differential, things like an overconcentration on the US market, and kind of, where this pipeline fits into the system that we've had for, again, Trans Mountain's case, over 70 years now. So I think the first thing that I really want to kind of stress here is how strange Canada is, and Canada's oil industry is, in relation to the rest of major producers around the world. Virtually all other producers get their products to market via tanker. It gets to global seaborne markets for a whole variety of different economic reasons. Those markets and those end customers can shift around based on needs and disruptions and everything else. But because of our kind of proximity, because of the Western Canadian sedimentary basins, the bounty that is there is kind of is geographically remote. It's in Alberta largely, obviously extends through BC and into Saskatchewan as well, but largely in around the oil sands in Alberta, with the Rocky Mountains kind of separating it from tidewater, and in many cases, virtually all of our pipelines, all of our crude gets to market by pipeline, not tanker generally. Like Heather had said, 96% of our crude oil exports go to the United States, and it's because of this, one of the largest, if not the largest system of export pipelines anywhere in the world, anywhere in the industry. Now, that brings with it a lot of stability, but it brings with it a lot of kind of fixed vulnerabilities as well, because when things go wrong in those end markets, we really can't shift things around. We don't have optionality. So the two things that Trans Mountain really, really does for this country and for the broader industry is it increases, like people were saying, it decreases the differential or increases the value we are receiving for our products. And secondly, it decreases our overdependence on US markets. And just to kind of show you, just to put in your mind how much we produce, how much we export, and how much ends up going to the United States, it is staggering. It's virtually everything goes to the US, particularly out of Western Canada. You have some let's say, Eastern Canadian production that does go elsewhere. But this is a very, very small portion of oil relative to what we typically talk about in Canada's oil industry. Even more, virtually all of that oil, 60%, goes to the Midwest only. And if you even dive a little bit deeper, not only does 60% just go to the Midwest of the United States, about 50% of Canada's oil exports go to just 10 refineries in the United States. These refineries don't change very much. And these locations don't change very much. What you have here is coking capacity displayed relative to Canadian exports. And coking is the type of refinery equipment that's required to refine our heavy kind of sour crude. But because of these kind of fixed relationships, we don't have a lot of flexibility when things start to go wrong. And they have very, very frequently gone wrong, both because of local kind of business conditions, let's say in the Midwest, but also because just generally the other kind of unfortunate reality of our situation in Canada is that it's been easier to build oil production than it has been to build oil egress. Or egress is a fancy word for takeaway capacity or pipelines and everything else. So for various periods over my career, the past decade or more, have been punctuated by these economically disastrous differential blows that have, in many cases, like Heather was saying in 2018, over $50 a barrel. If those differentials were sustained, we're talking billions, tens and tens of billions of dollars of lost Canadian economic activity, and that's just in a single year. So while I do think that, for instance, some of the economic benefits we see talked about from the Trans Mountain expansion are kind of in this kind of perfect world. But I think one of the biggest benefits it does is it reduces the probability of these truly disastrous outcomes. In the case of TMX and the kind of or TMEP, as we were discussing earlier, the cost was high, yes, but even 1 year of a differential blowout like that could easily pay for this pipeline and then some. That is the kind of scale of differential we're talking about here. And this is so the other thing is that, as I was saying, we don't build egress or pipelines as fast as we build oil production. And in many cases, people are like, oh, well, why didn't you plan them at the same time? Well, we did. We planned a lot of these pipelines. We planned Northern Gateway, Trans Mountain Expansion, Energy East, Keystone XL. All of these were planned in the mid-2010s, much along with all of the crude production capacity that was also planned. Unfortunately, those became the kind of center point of a broad array of political opposition, And those were delayed while the production didn't get delayed in the same way. So what you had was that white line there, which is the Canadian kind of demand for egress, or essentially all available production in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, would keep kind of knocking up and against. And you can kind of see in 2018 where it peaks above that line there, and that essentially overfilled all of the tanks in Alberta and pushed those differentials to absolutely staggering levels. So the thing that people kind of, I don't think, always appreciate outside of the industry about how this kind of works is there are kind of two main pieces. And while Canada produces a bunch of different oil, the main thing we sell abroad is called Western Canadian Select, or varieties of it. Heavy sour crude, which kind of has two components. One, which is the quality of that oil. It's a little harder to refine. It kind of has to be refined by these coking refiners, et cetera. So you have a little bit of a discount, if you will, on heavy crude. But that's kind of set by global conditions, and everyone in the world, every heavy oil producer in the world faces those conditions. So that's the dark blue portion there. The problem for Canadians and Canadian industry is that light blue portion, what I call the kind of transportation proxy. And essentially that is the difference in the price between a barrel of Western Canadian Select in Hardisty, Alberta, where it's primarily priced, and that same barrel all the way down at the US Gulf Coast. So theoretically, on a normal kind of, normal day, the differential in total for WCS, when it's healthy and we have sufficient pipelines, is around $13, $14 a barrel, give or take. But when we have those big blowouts like we did in 2018, what you can see is it's all in that light blue portion. And you kind of see just how crazy that differential got. And that's when we exceeded not just pipeline capacity, but rail. We overflowed our inventories, and all this stuff kind of came together in this gigantic head. And that is essentially when the Alberta government in that day forced curtailment across the entire industry, where you had to cut back production. Everyone had to share. I think they cut back about 300,000 barrels a day or so. Call it 8% of provincial production at the time. That seemed very draconian, but the value destruction that was going on was so immense that that was the best, worst thing that could be done in that moment. Now the challenge is that now going forward, back during this period, we all kind of had this variety of hope because, well, at that point we still had multiple different pipelines working through the system. We had Trans Mountain expansion, we had Keystone XL, we still, I think even at that stage, still had Energy East we were talking about and hoping about. Now, going forward, however, I'm just going to back up again a second to this one. So we're, this pipeline, the Trans Mountain expansion completion, it's an amazing achievement, both politically and technologically, but it's also the largest single expansion of this egress through this in kind of this past decade and the decade before. You had this kind of big jump up in overall capacity, which provides us with this nice big cushion that will provide us a little bit of safety, will provide investors certainty that those differentials don't blow it again anytime soon. But as you can see, it's not as much higher than that white line as kind of you would probably really love it to be. So in a couple of years, we could end up back in a situation like we found ourselves now or previously, where we don't have enough egress again. And the danger now is that we don't have Trans Mountain in the pipeline, if you will. We don't have Keystone. We don't have Energy East. What comes next? There's always going to be some widening of the expansion on the main line, but this has been promised before and has fallen flat. In 2018, we had rail that was clearing the edges, and that was good, more expensive. But again, those rail carloads also weren't sufficient to keep everything going. So what we essentially had was we had to force the curtailment. And when you're looking at the future of Canada's oil industry, we can't get more pipelines or more egress in the system. It will likely look like permanent curtailment, because there really is no other option. If you allow producers to produce and nothing else to kind of take that crude away, you will essentially destroy the entire industry. The industry will feast upon itself. So you have to kind of either have that egress built out, and the question is, I think as Ian said, who's going to do it? The federal government had to do it. They were the only ones left. Now, I think obviously the kind of Liberal government did not have a fantastic time with the experience, the politics around this pipeline. I think they're probably going to be gun-shy around that in the future. Who else? Probably not the private sector, or at least not without substantial kind of guarantees from government. So I think we really need to start having this debate and this conversation today about where does the next pipeline come from? Because by the time we're actively thinking about it, by the time the market's actually showing those signals, it's going to be way, way, way too late, particularly if another pipeline takes 14 years. So, all that said, kind of coming back to Trans Mountain and why it is so fascinating and so interesting is not only does it kind of provide us that jump forward in egress capacity that provides us that cushion and that security going forward for at least the next couple of years, but it also, more than it triples Canadian market access, or almost triples, Canadian market access to, to global industry, global markets, and substantially reduces our overwhelming dependence on these U.S. markets. And the hope here is not that we just have enough egress. We actually want a little bit more because we want that optionality. We want things like, for instance, the Keystone pipeline. Everyone knows Keystone. In the last kind of 5-6 years, we've had three major outages on the line, 3 major leaks that have caused, when that happens, we have like that big chunk of that egress chart drop out all of a sudden. And because we're always operating on that razor's edge of availability, of sufficiency, it all of a sudden has this cataclysmic backup effect. We want some optionality, we want some buffer. And that's, I think, right now at least, what Trans Mountain kind of achieves. And as you can kind of see on the right-hand side there, that's the Vancouver exports. We are already seeing record volumes of crude, as Bikram kind of alluded to. We're seeing kind of record volumes of crude leaving Vancouver, the Port of Vancouver. And finally, I think going forward, we are actually going to become a major kind of marker and contributor to heavy oil markets in the Pacific. We've already done this in the Gulf Coast. For those that aren't aware, WCS has largely replaced other major heavy kind of blends. In the Gulf Coast is the major market maker, a major price setter, and likely the most important heavy crude oil benchmark on planet Earth. All the rest are kind of this really lagged, government-focused kind of official selling price. And WCS, like the rest of our beautiful industry, is market determined and market set. That provides a huge amount of information to the industry and analysts like myself to figure out what's kind of going on in this situation. So, all that said, I want to congratulate everyone in this room, and particularly those that have just spoken, about their achievement in getting this pipeline across the finish line, and finally kind of allowing Canada to have a little bit of breathing room going forward and optionality. I think those are the things we really need to celebrate right now.
We're going to proceed with a little bit of a chat with our speakers, but this is a chance for you to go to the podium that's in the microphone in the middle of the room and ask any questions that you may have. Please keep your questions very succinct. State your name and your company name, and they will respond in turn. But I just wanted to ask you, first of all, I sit on our Regional Government's Economic Development Council for Metro Vancouver, comprised of 21 cities and Indigenous nations. And can you tell me how impactful already this investment around Trans Mountain has already made to our regional economy?
Well, I can start, and I think Bikram talked a lot about the construction, the jobs, so that's obviously had a huge impact. But one that I think Rory can get into, and I was trying to research to answer this question and to know the impact here, is that the price of gas has gone down in the region because of the availability. And so that makes everything more affordable. But certainly for Indigenous nations, one thing we haven't talked about is the future ownership of Trans Mountain. And that obviously we all anticipate there will be a consortium of Indigenous nations that own. We can speculate, me and Ian were speculating, maybe 30%. Danielle Smith indicated the number 30% ownership, maybe a third, as Ian was saying this morning. And certainly the communities, the Indigenous nations in this region would be part of such a concern. And we've seen already in other pipeline projects, other equity projects, that communities get revenues on day one. They use that, for their own public services, for their own infrastructure. And so that is an exciting, anticipating that moment when Indigenous communities get ownership of that project will certainly impact this region too. But if you had some more local data, Rory.
Yeah, so specifically on this point you made about the kind of local and lower mainland gasoline prices, it's a really interesting one because a decision, I want to say, I can't remember exactly how long ago, but it was a couple years ago, reduced the amount of gasoline that was flowing, because the legacy Trans Mountain pipeline did not just flow heavy crude oil. It flowed a variety of products, among which was refined products like gasoline from Edmonton down into the lower mainland. The decision by regulators reduced that amount of refined products that could flow on in favor of more crude, again, because there was issues with getting crude out of Western Canada. So what that did, though, is because there isn't enough refining capacity available in and around the Vancouver area, you had to import that much more on tankers, which increased costs, et cetera. So I don't have the exact number, but I want to say it's something on the order of like 8 cents a liter or something like that, you will see a gradual improvement in gasoline prices and a narrowing of the gap between Vancouver, which has almost always had the highest gasoline prices in Canada, largely because of this kind of isolation from the rest of the market and a requirement on that. So the expansion of Trans Mountain is going to allow more refined product to flow in those pipes as well, which will allow, or at least narrow, that differential between Vancouver and the rest of the country's prices.
And it lowers inflation. Right?
And it lowers inflation.
Do you think there needs to be another refinery in British Columbia?
Ooh. So here's the challenge. Refineries are really expensive. As we've seen, the last refinery built in Alberta was the Sturgeon refinery, which is a bitumen upgrader to diesel. It was almost $10 billion. So a very, very expensive proposition. So you would need considerable kind of uplift in prices. And I think that at this stage, with more refined product flowing into Vancouver, and I think generally with most forward-looking expectations that Canada generally will see gasoline peak first of the various petroleum products, and I think given BC's push on electric vehicles, you will likely see that here faster than, let's say, even Ontario, where I live. So I think that it is probably not economically optimal to build another refinery here right now. That said, it is always a trade-off between kind of pure economic efficiency and like a beautiful economic model and the optionality again, because I think that once again, let's say you had one of the major refineries in the area go down, it's always valuable to have some kind of optionality there. So I would say I don't expect a refinery to be built in Canada again, and I would say if it was going to be built in a province, I probably wouldn't think it's in the Vancouver area, just because of the various opposition we've seen. But again, I think that it would be an interesting proposal.
Any questions from the audience? Please approach the microphone, or I'm going to continue. One of the things that we've done in Surrey is in March I was in Taiwan for the Smart City Summit on a bit of a Surrey roadshow showcasing our economic assets. In April, Mexico, and then I just returned from Dublin Tech in Ireland. And one of the key pieces is they believe the private sector drives the economy. Do you think there's room for global investors when it comes to energy infrastructure in our nation?
Rory will have a more detailed point of that, but from a political perspective, we all are aware that the Canadian economy is not firing on all cylinders, and we'd like to see more growth and more productivity. But when you look at elsewhere in the world, there's not a lot of great safe havens for investment elsewhere either. And Canada still, if you look at country risk assessments, we know the battery supply chain, our number one ranking there. A lot of that is tied that we still do have phenomenal resource base and a pretty good rule of law and that kind of thing. And so if we had just the slightest bit of enthusiasm in our country for energy development, I think a lot of investors would be happy to park their money here. And so, I always say, how much do we think the TSX will go up on October 25th after the next election? All that party would have to do is talk a good game of welcoming that investment, and I think it would start flowing it. So the prospects, sometimes we say it's too late, we missed the boat, the LNG oil. It is not too late, and you cannot conceive of a civilization in 100 years or 1,000 years that doesn't use chemicals or plastics. Even when we stop burning this stuff, we will still be using hydrocarbons. So Canada is not too late. In fact, we're positioned quite well. In the next 2 years, we'll finally start seeing some benefits of that.
Yeah, so just on the, it's never too late or we're too late kind of idea, I remember talking about this back at Scotiabank in, the mid-2010s, and people were talking about we were too late on LNG then. And obviously, the United States leapt forward from that point to become a world leader in LNG over that period, so they clearly didn't think it was too late. So I think it's always, in relative terms. But to your question about kind of Canadian or the international contribution to, let's say, into Canada's energy industry. I'll leave my comments primarily focused on oil here because that's kind of what I do for most of my day. But if anything, so far we've seen the exact opposite over the past half decade to a decade. We've seen an evacuation of foreign capital from our oil industry. I think this is largely because we have a branding problem. And I think, yes, upstream oil production in Canada is more emissions intensive, but I think that narrative and that branding can change very quickly. I think, because of the unique nature of Canadian oil assets, unlike in the United States where you have, tens of thousands of shale wells through the Permian Basin, there are 100 facilities in Alberta produce the vast majority of emissions. You can uniquely hook up these assets to things like carbon capture and sequestration that's being envisioned in the Pathways Alliance. So I think those are the types of things that government can, I think, and should and really needs to invest and get the ball rolling on, because it's that kind of stuff that will contribute and allow people like me to kind of talk up the benefits of the some of the highest emissions assets in the world becoming all of a sudden the lowest. And I think that is, an opportunity that we don't discuss enough around that rebranding.
If I can just add one more thing, based on what Rory said, Ipsos actually did a global survey of who was your preferred supplier of oil, and Canada actually came on top. And so we do have consumers. One thing I also wanted to mention, with TMX this year, Canada will probably be the country with the most growth in oil production in the world. And so even though, things kind of look bad, on paper, we've never produced more. We will hit more records, and we are finding customers for all that oil.
So Friday is National Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st. And I know you referenced, each of you, in your remarks about this, but true economic reconciliation, true reconciliation in action is around partnerships in energy infrastructure in our nation. What is your perspective on the future in terms of Indigenous partnerships in this sector?
I can start. I spent a lot of time, and my colleague Zach Gauthier is here from the Indigenous Resource Network that I do work with. But this is, I think, the most untold story of TMX, because I've been able to hear Ian speak on the Indigenous portion of it, on Indigenous specific panels, and the consultation, the engagement that went in, moving the pipe based on community feedback, the archaeological aspects, unprecedented. And maybe a private pipeline operator or a private project proponent probably wouldn't have done all the things that TMX did, but it is a spectacular story, and we haven't begun to start telling it. But in general, what is the trend? Indigenous resource development participation, there's before 2004 and after 2004. 2004 is when the Supreme Court decision on the duty to consult came about. And I think in BC, especially where you didn't have treaties, there was a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties. There's a big period of flux. This just happens to be when TMX is coming online and LNG was becoming a global market. And there was a lot of, crazy things, I think uncertainty then. But now you've turned that weakness, what some people called weakness, into a strength. You are the best in the world. I look at this from a global perspective. BC has become the best in the world of providing partnerships, equity, benefits to Indigenous peoples. They have become incredibly sophisticated. Look at Chief Crystal Smith as an example, but I could list another dozen who have become very sophisticated players out on the global stage themselves, advocating for them and their communities and their right to development. And so, what the evolution that we have seen is unprecedented. There's billions of dollars of revenues going into Indigenous communities. For me, it's the best path forward, absolutely.
Yeah, and really the only thing I'll add to that is I think that the idea of having equity ownership of these pipelines by Indigenous communities is a fantastic way of kind of actually facilitating that like real true ownership of the means of production, if you will, within these borders. I think that's a fantastic way of kind of channeling funds into these communities that otherwise wouldn't have access to this type of economic opportunity, and in a way that I think takes a lot of these aren't in many cases we were talking earlier about the reclamation and efforts being made to kind of make the area look like they never dug a pipeline through there. You can't for better or worse you can't say the same thing about an oil sands mine. So I think the unique thing about pipelines and infrastructure is that you can build this, you can funnel a huge amount of money into these communities without the kind of outright disruption and kind of environmental change that would happen with other types of projects.
I just wanted to speak about another aspect of energy infrastructure. So tonight and over the next 2 days is the High Cell Convention, the Hydrogen Industry Convention, and we're trying to make Surrey a hydrogen industry destination. Can you tell me your perspective about the future of hydrogen as our overall Canadian energy infrastructure ingredient?
So the thing I think about hydrogen is obviously this is it can be produced in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think, we have the whole, they talk about like the rainbow of hydrogen from it's like the purple and there's green and there's gray, et cetera. And I think there's two questions about like one, how you produce the hydrogen. And there's also the question of where it's used. And I think there's been a lot of different proposals over the past decade as to where we can see increased hydrogen penetration, everything from blending hydrogen into natural gas streams and residential heating. But I think where you really see, in my mind, the two most kind of acute and highest value use cases for hydrogen are in, and that's, I'm saying outside of the normal current uses, are things like, on the first point, local or kind of closed circuit energy or transportation systems, things like port infrastructure. Reworking all port equipment to work off of hydrogen rather than compressed natural gas or batteries or whatever. I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is, one area that people are always talking about the difficulty in, decarbonizing is the steel industry. What we have seen is a huge opportunity for hydrogen in industrial heat. Where a lot of other renewable and pure power kind of aspects don't have the same kind of capacity to all of a sudden go from like zero to very high heat the way that hydrogen can.
I'll just add one more thing is hydrogen is expensive now. We all know that. And so we're trying to build a market. And so really, I think we're looking at medium-term and long-term things. One thing, though, is Canada is already the world's #5 exporter of ammonia, which is usually the hydrogen carrier. So it's not a foreign concept. People produce it. People use it already. We're looking for other alternatives. But thinking of the long term, if we are going to have net zero, stop combusting fossil fuels, and I don't know that we'll do it by 2035 or 2050, but one day we will do it. We are still going to need gas, and we are still going to need molecules. And that will probably have to be filled by hydrogen, because you still need something to store, and there's still particular purposes that electricity can never take over. And so I think there's absolutely value in being that leader. I think there's value even in the public sector providing, funding for the research and development that can make Canada stand out. And the other thing I'll say about hydrogen, though, is it's difficult to ship and transport. There's a case to be made of sending our LNG and letting them turn it into hydrogen on the other side instead of shipping it as ammonia or as hydrogen today. So many different ways that we can build that hydrogen economy, and many ways that you can build on it, the foundation of the infrastructure that BC is building today.
So I just wanted to ask you, other parts of the world want to buy our LNG. And what do you think is the problem? Like, why is it that we as a nation can't be true LNG partners to the rest of the world?
I'm going to say something quick here, and then I'm going to I know Heather does more currently on LNG than I do. I used to do more work in a previous life. But I should say, and I used to work, and my former colleague Pat Moore is at the mic for a question here. But at Scotiabank, we did a lot of work over the past decade on LNG and the kind of investability of it. And the challenge is, I think part of it is obviously the same types of political and environmental and kind of call it, pejoratively like NIMBY-esque kind of pushback that we saw on things like the Trans Mountain expansion. But I also think it also goes to the fact that Canada as a culture just generally is more risk averse on big projects and big risks like this. Whereas we see south of the border, the U.S. went from being the largest natural gas importer to being the largest LNG exporter in a decade. It's difficult to imagine Canada catalyzing that type of energy and kind of momentum. Again, it took us 14 years to build TMX. It would be staggering to think that we could build, 280, billion cubic meters annually of LNG export capacity. But the resource base we have is in the Montney is unparalleled. And this gas is largely stranded here without other avenues to market. Heather had spoken previously about the way that the shale revolution in the United States has kind of really had stymied or kind of limited our market access for oil, but it's been even more kind of acute in natural gas markets. And I think anyone that has any kind of touch points with the natural gas industry and the Canadian pricing in AECO, ACO has in many cases been at $0 or negative very frequently. To have an ability to open that up to global markets and not need to depend on, I hope that, I hope there's a cold winter so U.S. gas production kind of dips down and we have an opportunity to get back in. That I don't think is a long-term sustainable market access strategy. So I think LNG is the only real way. And I think that if it's going to be anywhere, it's going to be in BC.
I'll just add, you mentioned I was at the Wilson Center as a global fellow there, and when I was there in 2022, I said I was going to write a paper comparing the Canadian and the American regulatory system because we are so jealous of, what they have down south. And the person, said to me, you had to do one of the American, Canadian, and the Texan regulatory systems. And so the Texan market and the ability of Texas to get Permian gas to the Gulf of Mexico is a very different thing than everyone else is facing. But like I said, we have LNG Canada Phase 1, we have CGL completed, we have wood fiber, we have Cedar, we have Casilla Sims, we have probably LNG Canada Phase 2 one day. Like, it is all starting to come. I'm finally feeling some optimism. And there is a lot more. This is the longest in an energy event that no one has mentioned AI so far in 2024. We took an hour to do it, but here it comes. The demand of natural gas for artificial intelligence, is, in many ways stunning. We are seeing increases, whereas IEA, anticipated that North America would have decline in natural gas electricity. It's gone up, 11%, whatever the number was. And so we are seeing demand from LNG. We are seeing demand from natural gas electricity. We are seeing demand from AI and data centers. Again, BC is not too late. And with Casilla Sims LNG Phase 2, there's a lot going on. Pacific, or the Prince George transmission pipeline. And I think pipelines was the problem. And you had to have a lot of persistence. There's not a lot of Ian Andersons out there to have the persistence to finish TMX or CGL in BC and hopefully get a third one done. But I think that was obviously the bottleneck.
Yeah.
Our last question to the microphone.
Thank you all for your great presentations. I'd like to just move the conversation back to the outlook for Western Canadian oil through the TMX pipeline. Where do you see the demand growth for that crude? In what countries? How about California? And of course, there's a great deal of skepticism about the medium-term outlook for crude. But what would you say about that?
Yeah, thank you, Pat. So there are a couple elements here. So I think the first thing I'll talk about briefly is the California angle, because obviously, as I was presenting, one of the really compelling aspects of TMX is the kind of diversification away from the United States. So there was a line of kind of push for a little while that it wasn't really going to diversify away from the United States. It was just going to all end up in California. So it's more of the same. But I actually think that what we've seen so far, and I'll be curious, the proof will be in the pudding, as to where these tankers actually end up. But so far, the lion's share seem to be destined for Asia. And maybe Bikram can add more comment to that later. But I think what we have seen is that there is some degree of cap on the amount of Canadian, particularly high sulfur crude that California refineries can take. And while, let's say, the incremental volumes out of TMX, let's say ballpark, let's say 500, only about 100,000 barrels of that, or 20%, will likely end up in the LA area, which is where the majority of the kind of refinery capacity is. This is based off of estimates of a good friend of mine that did really good work around this. But I think what that says and kind of necessitates is that the bulk of that 80% or more is going to end up in Asian markets. And one thing I didn't mention here is that one of the things that, because of the kind of lack of export capacity out of the West Coast, what actually our crude was doing for a long time was going all the way down to the Gulf Coast via Keystone and Mainline through all of the interconnections, and actually being re-exported to the tune of 300,000 barrels a day out of the Gulf Coast through the Panama Canal and then to Asia. So talk about kind of like, this is much better, a much simpler way of doing it. But where were those barrels going? They were going to India and China. So what you've seen is these are the countries where you have, one, the largest kind of source, single area of demand for these kind of heavier crudes. But also, particularly in India, we're expecting to see more and more build out of new capacity. So I do think that where to your question, Pat, where I see the demand, it's going to be in Asia. It's likely going to be in India largely in terms of the largest denominator we're talking about. But yeah, I think that's and in terms of the broader outlook, for those who aren't aware, the IEA recently released Oil 2024, which is their medium-term outlook. And it generally showed for the first time a peak in oil demand in 2029 within their outlook, and it caused a huge amount of controversy in the industry. I would say that my own position is somewhere between that of the IEA and OPEC, which doesn't see a peak at all through 2050. But I think that, those types of forecasts, I think, are what they do is they create more doubt and more risk. And I think when people are talking about, I was saying earlier, who's going to build the next pipeline? Well, now they're going to say, oh, well, the IEA says oil demand is going to peak in 2029. Why would I build another pipeline? Which in turn creates scarcity, which in turn increases prices. So there's always this kind of nasty feedback mechanism for not investing in capacity in these areas. So I think that's, again, where Canada can be a leader, is kind of taking, I think as Heather really put it well, is we are a unique producer and holder of hydrocarbon reserves within NATO, within the Western Alliance. And I think this is the kind of thing that we can and I think need to do. And by exporting to these areas and by developing these markets and by gaining strength in these markets, that's how you have leverage. That's how people have been saying one of the largest barrels that's going to be displaced in Asia is Iraqi Basra heavy. So I might be biased, but I would much rather the Chinese and the Indians be consuming kind of Western Canadian heavy than Iraqi heavy. And I think that I think many people, I think they would probably agree.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Rory and Heather. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to welcome to the stage Stuart Muir, CEO of ResourceWorks, our partner on this event. A round of applause for Stuart, please.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Anita and the Surrey Board of Trade for hosting this. It's an important conversation. I think we should count ourselves privileged today to really, at the debut of Vancouver, Metro Vancouver, this port as a globally significant export site for Canadian crude. We're at the beginning of something that is important. You've heard the numbers, the stats, remember those. But I think the thing that I'm going to remember is that this is the day, June 17th, where we really got schooled by first-class minds who really understand these issues on what has happened here in Canada. So congrats for bringing that to us, and I thank you on behalf of the audience for being here. So thank you. And a couple of other acknowledgments to Anita, who saw the importance of this topic and gathered together here. It's just something that has to be recognized. It is complicated. It has been polarizing. For those who've been in this for 10, 12 years, it's been exhausting, and trying to go to the facts and ensure that we're on the right track, to be as concerned with the economic as with the environmental performance. These are things that people of character and integrity who built this infrastructure have been dedicated to, every one of you who's here in that. And we can have critics, but we know we're on the right course. We're supplying the world with what the world is going to get, one way or the other. They're getting from Canada the best that it can be, and I am really proud of that. Even though at times over the last 10 years since ResourceWorks started, around the same time as Ian and the team was ramping up what they were doing, there's been some challenging times, but we're all here and we've made it happen. I'd like to say thanks to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't their sponsorship. Also Fortis BC, so generously as a community sponsor, and the Progressive Contractors Association, representing some of the many, many thousands of workers who got it done. And a couple of last things. I know it's slightly over time here, so I'll go quickly. I'd like to, the work of ResourceWorks, as we partner with the Surrey Board of Trade on things, which we will be doing in future. Anita mentioned the outreach that will be following this. We are going to be continuing this. There's someone in the room visiting. Jerry, if I could maybe just raise your hand. Jerry and I will be working through 2024 and beyond to bring this conversation to the rest of the country. We're embarking on some important work because I think in the boards of trade, the chambers of commerce across Canada, we need to have recognition of it. It starts by people who understand it to be part of that. And later this week on the 20th of June, and you'll all be getting an email with this, we're holding a town hall on the future of energy in British Columbia. Our new Energy Futures Institute started in December of 2023. by Barry Penner is going to be conducting this town hall, and I hope you can find time to take part in it. It's a digital thing. A couple of other things we're doing at ResourceWorks, and I'll acknowledge that our not-for-profits chair is in the room. That's Richard Prokopanko. Richard, will you stand or wave? Richard recently came into the role of leadership. And it means so much to us to have that. Our work, it's not just the energy futures, not just events like this, it's also our recent report From Gas to Growth. Another story in LNG, of course, now that LNG Canada is nearing completion, it will be equally transformative for all Canadians. Every Canadian, it's not just that people get 8 cents cheaper gas, it's that it lifts up the ability of Canada to be a country that can provide education and healthcare, and to, when we think back 2 weeks ago, we held another event in our programs. That was our Indigenous Partnerships Success Showcase. It's through the resource sector and its ability to distribute wealth all across the country that we are seeing reconciliation advance as quickly as we are. So those are just some of our programs, and I thank all of those who've been friends along the journey of these 10 years. And on that note, I'm going to wrap things up on behalf of the Board of Trade and ResourceWorks. Thank you for being here.